Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for the USDTL Talks Time. I'm your host, Madeline Tallarico. Today's presenter is Dr. Joseph Jones, Chief Operating Officer with USDTL. He will be discussing the EtG in hair and nail, a review and recent updates. Before we get started, I would like to cover a few things. This presentation is being recorded, and we will be sharing this event with everyone that registered. Some parts of this presentation will be interactive with poll questions that will appear on your screen. We encourage everyone to participate. We will answer your questions at the end of the presentation as long as time permits. The Q&A section should automatically appear on the right side of your screen. If you don't see it, please click the three dots at the bottom right of your screen and select Q&A. Without further ado, I would like to turn this over to Dr. Joseph Jones.
Thank you for that introduction. Welcome to this edition of ToxTime. My name is Joseph Jones, Chief Operating Officer at United States Drug Testing Laboratories. Let's get started. Today, we would like to talk about ethyl glucuronide in hair and nail, a review and some recent updates. So we go to many conferences throughout the year. And one of the things that has really struck me as interesting is that alcohol is by far the biggest issue that we have with a substance use disorder, not just in this country, but globally. But as generally it's talked, unless you're at an alcohol specific conference, it's spoken much less frequently than the other drugs. However, if we look at just American data, we have 15.3 million people with an alcohol use disorder only, and 1.9 million have a drug use disorder, and that's all other drugs besides alcohol, and we have 2.3 million that have both. So by and large, many more people have an issue with alcohol use disorder than they do all the other drugs put together, even in the throes of this opioid epidemic. And this cartoon on the right was presented at a conference this past summer, and it resonated with me because I'm right there in the room and no one even acknowledges me, says the elephant in the room. So today we're going to talk about ethyl glucuronide. And so what is ethyl glucuronide and why is it important? Ethyl glucuronide is a long-term ethanol biomarker. It's a non-oxidative metabolite of ethanol, and it accumulates in a variety of fluids and tissues, including urine, hair, nails, and for the newborn side, umbilical cord. The ethanol that is consumed is metabolized by UDP glucurontransferase, and that's called a phase 2 metabolite or phase 2 metabolism, and it forms ethyl glucuronide, and once it's formed, has a half-life of 2 to 3 hours. This is way longer than detecting ethanol itself, and it is a direct ethanol biomarker. What do I mean by that? In the red circle, you can see the ethanol itself incorporated into this larger ethyl glucuronide molecule. That is what is meant by a direct marker. An indirect marker would be something that measures the damage done by alcohol, such as MCV. That is a measure of some damage that has been done by alcohol, which is not as specific because that damage could be from a number of other things other than alcohol. When this first came out, and EtG in urine was the first assay to really get to market, in a couple of markets that were very behind the eight ball as far as monitoring alcohol consumption, a lot of the professional wellness programs where people were being directed towards treatment for a variety of substance use disorders like hydrocodone, oxycodone, etc. And underlying all of this was an alcohol use disorder. And in many instances, it was not discovered. And unless you're addressing all of it, you're really not addressing any of it. And so in the early 2000s, when EtG in urine came on board, it was like a huge improvement for what we were using prior to that, which was testing for ethanol itself, which has a detection window of hours, and self-report, which in these environments has very little value. It's very sensitive. We could pick up single drinks. We could pick up single binges for a long period of time. And so everything was really good until it wasn't so good. So while it picks up single drinks and binges, unintentional ingestion, we discovered the hard way that, yeah, you don't have to intentionally ingest alcohol in order to have a positive EtG in urine. So we went through several years with a controversy about the cutoff. Is it 100? Is it 500? Is it 1500? Is it 2000? Lots of papers were on all kinds of columns with regard to the cutoff that we needed. Do we normalize it to creatinine? Normalize it to creatinine 100? Normalize it to creatinine of 1? So a lot of controversy there. And at the end of the day, you still had the same old issues of urine. You had the potential of dilution, whether it was like internal dilution or diluting following the collection. You had substitution issues. And then from a collector's point of view, you've got the blue water setting up the dry room for a collection. And you've got gender issues for direct observed collections. To top all of that off, there was a huge class action lawsuit where a group of people who felt like and were harmed by the excessive use of Purell generating low-level positives, and they were receiving disciplinary action or being removed from their livelihoods based on those results. And so this was a big deal between, say, 2000 and 2005, 2006. So then along came the first paper that I recall seeing about EtG in hair. And I'm like, well, how in the world do you get EtG in the hair and how do you extract it out? So this paper, from my perspective, was really interesting. So it's out of a German laboratory, Institute of Legal Medicine. And so they had 11 post-mortem cases with reported alcohol use disorders, and they used 3 children as controls. Now, in this paper, they were able to identify all of these, but their limit of detection was 5,000 picograms per milligram. And these numbers are really high, but they didn't have access to internal standards like we do today. And it was the first method out of the gate. And how do you extract it and work with it? So a lot of questions on the method itself, but it was really encouraging that from a hair sample, which implies you can get a long detection window, they were able to identify these post-mortem cases with alcohol use disorders. Then came another paper in 2002 out of Germany as well, where they moved this over to a more sensitive platform, and they had 97 cases. 27 were post-mortem cases like before. They had 60 cases of alcohol use disorder who are in current treatment. They had 5 social drinkers, and they had 5 children, again, as controls. And they had very good performance of this assay. So this was really exciting. So before we kind of get into what these results meant, we should probably take just a minute and reflect on how is EtG incorporated in hair, and then we'll talk about in fingernail. So just how are analytes incorporated into hair? First and foremost is environmental exposure. Now this applies to other drugs and not EtG because we're not looking for ethanol itself, so this would be irrelevant. But when you're looking at other drugs, the parent drug or the native drug itself will get trapped into the hair, and then we can harvest it and analyze the hair immediately. Route number 2 is the sweat and the oil from the scalp. These fluids contain drug and drug metabolite. As these fluids bathe the hair shaft, they deposit the drug and drug metabolite into the hair, works its way into the nooks, crannies, and pores, and binds to the proteins and or pigments, and is available to be harvested and analyzed within a few hours. It starts to show up within a few hours, not necessarily making it positive, but we can start to see it showing up in a few hours. Route number 3 is the blood traveling through the root. Obviously contains drug and drug metabolite. It deposits these compounds into the root, and as the hair emerges past the scalp line, it can then be harvested and analyzed. And that process takes about a week. So at the end of the day, we have a very complex picture here. They're overlapping. Hair grows at approximately a ½ inch a month. Drug is being incorporated in, and it's also being eliminated due to normal daily hygiene and exposure to the elements. But all said and done, we end up with a detection window for most compounds that are up to approximately 3 months. Before we talk about the nail, we need to know a couple of pieces of anatomy of the fingernail. So in the top picture, we can see the nail plate, which is the part that you can see on your finger on the top. You can pinch it, it turns white, you let it go and it springs back to red. That's because you've got a lot of capillary blood flow in the nail bed, which is under the nail plate. In the picture on the bottom, to the right is the germinal matrix, which is back behind the cuticle. This is where the nail material forms, and then it starts to grow out. And once it erupts past the quick, that is called the distal or the free edge. How are analytes incorporated into fingernail? We have environmental exposure. If you're in the area or you're handling these drugs, the drug will become bound to the proteins in your nail and will be trapped and preserved. The sweat and the oil from the surrounding skin, they contain drug and drug metabolite, and as they bathe the nail material, they deposit the drug or drug metabolite, and it's available to be harvested and analyzed pretty quickly. We see a lot more of this probably with toenail because it's in your socks and shoes all day. They tend to be a little more sweaty than your hands, which are kind of out in the open, and you're washing them a couple of times a day. So the sweat and the oil has more contribution with toenail than with fingernail. And similar to hair, the blood contains drug and drug metabolite, and as it travels through the germinal matrix where the nail is being formed, it becomes entrapped. But then we have this other mode of incorporation that's a little different than with hair. Blood deposits into the underside of the nail from the nail bed with that capillary blood flow we were talking about earlier. And with the fingernail, they grow in two directions. They grow in length and thickness. So as that nail is migrating across the nail bed, it is picking up material along the way, and it's being incorporated from the underside. So when we get to the free edge or the distal edge and do it and prepare a clipping for testing, we have a history of the entire trip across the nail bed. And for fingernails, that's up to approximately 3 to 6 months. So a really long detection window potential. So as with hair, these modes of incorporation are superimposed and it's a complex picture. Fingernail has a growth rate of approximately 3 millimeters per month. Therefore, a clipping gathered at the tip of the finger represents approximately 3 to 6 months of growth and therefore brackets the detection window. A nail is approximately 4 times thicker than the average hair. This means that an analyte that has become entrapped in the nail is going to be more protected from the environment than it would be entrapped in the hair. And this leads to slightly higher concentrations and also a little longer detection window and increased sensitivity reflected in the positivity rates. Now that we've reviewed how drugs and drug metabolites are incorporated into hair and nail, and before we take a look into literature on EtG in hair and nail, if you could please answer a quick poll question for us. Have your clients inquired about testing for EtG in hair or nail? Thank you. And so now let's take a look at some important papers from the literature. Early on, there was no clear guidance or data to show exactly what cutoff should be used. And it was also unknown whether or not EtG in hair or the detection thereof would be a reliable, consistent marker for chronic consumption. So this group from Italy published this paper back in 2006, taking a look at those questions. So they recruited 21 patients that all had a alcohol use disorder. They captured them at the time that they were entering treatment. They collected hair samples during intake, and they asked the patients to fill out a questionnaire. And here are the findings for the 21 patients. We can see that their results ranged from the cutoff all the way up to a little over 400. Displaying the results in a box and whisker plot allows us to better visualize the range of results that they achieved in their study. The median of these analyses was 39.3, with interquartile ranges going from 15.5 up to 81.8. This data was influential in establishing the Society of Hair Testing cutoff of 30 picograms per milligram, which is noted here with the red line. A little later, another paper was executed by a group from Scandinavia, and they had 44 participants. 14 of them were drinkers, 18 of them were teetotalers. There were females were given 1 standard drink per day, and males were given 2 standard drinks per day, and they did this for 3 months. Their lower limit of quantitation was 2 picograms per milligram, way lower than that 5,000 number that we started out with 12 years earlier. And so here are their results. So we'll start at the bottom here. Out of their teetotalers, 20 of them were negative, and 2, they found trace amounts of EtG. For the females that were having 1 drink per day for 3 months, 8 of them were negative, and 5 had trace amounts, but only 1 was positive above their 2 limit of quantitation. And for that sample, they found 3 picograms per milligram. For the men drinking 2 drinks a day, or 32 grams of ethanol, 1 of those was negative, 2 they found trace amounts, and on 4 of those patients, they found EtG above their cutoff of 2 picograms per milligram. And those results ranged from 5 up to 11 picograms per milligram. Now, do keep in mind that the cutoff that our laboratory uses is 20 picograms per milligram, and the cutoff suggested by the Society of Hair Testing to pick up chronic excessive drinking is 30 picograms per milligram. These papers and other like them were very influential in allowing the Society of Hair Testing to disseminate their consensus statement about EtG in hair testing, and specifically statement 4.3.1, a concentration greater than or equal to 30 picograms per milligram EtG in the proximal head hair, which is the segment closest to the scalp, with a length of 3 centimeters up to 6 centimeters, strongly suggest chronic excessive alcohol consumption. And in this context, chronic excessive alcohol consumption is consistent with 4 to 5 binges per month. Earlier this year, this paper was published that was looking at what does it look like if we test a whole lot of self-reported teetotalers, or people that abstain from drinking. They recruited 126 participants. They self-reported abstinence for the 6 months prior to the study. They collected hair and nail specimens and analyzed them both for EtG. The lower limit of quantitation was 2.1, which again is a far cry from the original 5,000 picogram limit of detection that we saw earlier 22 years ago. So this team recruited 126 participants. However, 15 of these participants were excluded from the study for a variety of reasons. Out of the 111 remaining participants, 107 of the hair specimens were less than the lower limit of quantitation. And for the nail specimens, 97 were less than the lower limit of quantitation. So that means that 4 hair specimens had detectable EtG and 14 nail specimens had detectable EtG. Now for the hair, very low levels. Those 4 specimens were 2.1, 2.1, 2.9, and 3.5 picograms per milligram. So way below our 20 picogram per milligram cutoff. For the 14 nail samples, they ranged from 2.1 all the way up to 23 picograms per milligram. So a couple of these would have indeed been positive at the 20 cutoff that we have. And the outcome of this study was that low concentrations of fingernails does not contradict teetotaling. EtG can be detected in fingernails when undetectable in hair. And EtG in fingernails were below 7.6 picograms per milligram in 97.5% of the teetotalers. And what they're driving home there is that when you're doing large studies like this, you can expect there to be some specimens where either through deceit or recall bias, we did not get an accurate report of abstinence. However, with nail, we should be aware that samples just above the cutoff of 20 does not necessarily mean that the person was drinking problematically. So what trends are we seeing here at USDTL? So first, let's take a look at the positivity rates in hair and nail over the last couple of years. So on this chart on the left, we have the positivity rate, and on the bottom, we have the quarter of the year that is being analyzed. When we look at the hair using the blue squares, we can see that the positivity rates range from the mid 8% all the way up to almost 13% depending on the quarter in the year, and that there's been a slight trend upwards over the past few years, which is not surprising with all that we're hearing about the ramifications of COVID on our population. When we overlay the nail positivity results, we see that we get a few more positives with nail than we do with hair, as we would expect considering the last paper that we just reviewed. Not every quarter, but we do a lot fewer nails than we do hair. And so a few extra positives or a few extra negatives can produce a wider swing in positivity rate than the hair, which is generally a little more constant. So taking a look at how much EtG we find in head and hair, starting on the left, we have head hair and a box and whisker plot of all of the positives for this year to date. We see that the median concentration is 62, and that's the line that is split in the blue box there. That's the median. So the median means that half of the results were higher than 62 and half of the results were less than 62, not necessarily the average result. For these types of analyses, the means and the medians typically are a little different, and we should go with the median when analyzing this. We move over to the next box and whisker, and that is for body hair. And we can see that we did 262 body hair samples that were positive compared to 523 positive head hair samples. But again, the median, it was up, but just a little bit to 63, which is consistent, being that body hair tends to be a little coarser than head hair, and we would expect it to be a little higher, but we can see that it's not much higher. We move over to the right one more time. We have fingernails, and as we looked at the last paper that we reviewed, because fingernail is thicker, it preserves the EtG a little better, and it protects it from being washed out. So we can see that the median, so not only is the positivity rate a little higher with the fingernail, we can see that the median is at 77. So it's a little higher than the low 60s that we see with the head hair and the body hair. Then we move to toenail, which of course is even thicker than fingernail and is soaking in sweat and oil in our shoes and socks all day. We don't wash our feet multiple times a day like we do our hands, so it's not surprising that we see an even higher median of 118 picograms per milligram. So these results are handy to look at when you're evaluating your participant and you get your result back. You can sort of place your result in these box and whisker plots and get an idea of how the story or the self-report may or may not be matching up with the result. So in conclusion, hair ETG is an effective monitoring tool, especially when you couple it with other specimen types to fill in the gaps. Nail is a suitable alternative, especially when you have situations where you have obviously cosmetically treated hair or in situations where there just is not enough hair to collect. Nail is slightly more sensitive than hair with regard to ETG, and we find that the ETG concentrations in nail are a little higher than what we find in hair. Here at USDTL, we are on a mission to make a difference. Our clients have told us that they appreciate all of the infographics, poster, and news articles that we have on our website. Please feel free to go to USDTL.com and pull down these resources and share them with your colleagues or your clients. They're free for your use. You may also be wondering about if you're set up to do ETG testing. Please feel free to call our client services at the number below and ask them what testing options are available to you. If you need to know how to order the test, client services will be certainly happy to walk you through that process. And if you're not set up to send samples to USDTL, please email adult and child at USDTL, and they would be very excited to help set up an account with us to send samples to USDTL. So I thank you for your time and attention today, and now we'll turn it over to some Q&A.
Thank you, Dr. Jones, for that wonderful presentation. Hello, everyone. My name is Jenny Olivos, and I will be moderating today's event. Please enter any questions in the Q&A tab, but before we get started, I've got a poll question for you. I will give you a few seconds to answer that question. Are you currently testing for alcohol at your facility? All right. We will do our best to get as many questions as we can. Any questions we don't get to today will be followed up on after this event. I will begin with some questions that were submitted through our registration. Dr. Jones, so our first question today is, can quantity of alcohol consumed in a time window be determined in hair nail samples?
Yes, thank you, Jenny. Can you hear me? I was kind of bumping around a little bit. Am I good?
You're good.
All right, outstanding. So kind of a yes and a no on that question. So these tests are not designed, or you can't design them to be therapeutic drug monitoring, which means that, we get the number and we can predict exactly what they've been drinking. At the end of the day, these long-term alcohol biomarkers are best used if we're just describing as abstinence monitoring, is someone abstinent or not. But having said that, there's literature that will suggest that at this level, above that level is consistent with a certain behavior. So for instance, with ETG in hair, Society of Hair Testing and their colleagues have published enough papers that they feel confident saying that if you have an ETG hair greater than 30, that's consistent with chronic excessive drinking. If you've got a result that's less than 7, that is not inconsistent with abstinence, and then you've kind of got this in-between range. Our cutoff is 20, and so we felt like that 30 was a little too high for the purposes that our tests were being used for. So we set our cutoff at 20, and I think in this country, pretty much everybody's using 20. You have the same scenario with PETH and blood spot. You've got these ranges of like less than 20, between 20 and 200, and then greater than 200 as being these gross categorizations of consistent with abstinence or consistent with chronic excessive drinking or somewhere in between. And so kind of think about it like that when you're looking at these numbers. We can't predict that someone had 6 drinks 3 weeks ago. That's out of the realm of, that is a limitation of the assay. You just can't do that.
Thank you. So does nail polish or nail polish remover affect results? And what about acrylic nails?
Okay,
Very common.
yeah, good question. So at our lab, we do not accept samples that have been that appear to have cosmetic treatment on them. You get gels and acrylics and all of that. And if you've got a thick layer of polish on there, we do this by weight. And so if we're weighing out 20 milligrams of material, well, if 5 milligrams of that is paint, so that would affect the test. So we insist on the specimen being cleaned. And if that means they need to run out and get a professional to remove these things, then so be it. With like the acrylics and the gels, theoretically, that should protect the nail from the contribution from sweat and oil. But with fingernail, that's probably not so much. With toenail, with the toe and sock scenario, sweating in a toe and sock, that may be more of an issue there because a lot of the concentration could be coming from the sweat and the oil. But with the hair, I mean, with the fingernail, probably not. Has there been any specific studies like quantifying that effect? No, I'm not aware of those studies.
Thank you. So does acetone, does exposure to alcohol or acetone trigger a positive?
Good question. So when these tests first started coming out, that considering one of the first slides in the presentation, this was like one of the first questions out of the gate is like, what happens when you're using ethanol containing hairspray? What happens? And so the literature is quite clear in that exposure of the scalp or the fingers to ethanol does not create EtG at the site. And so that's an advantage of using hair and fingernail EtG.
Thank you. Can EtG be used to detect single use, for instance, for like a probation testing or treatment program?
In urine, but not hair. It is very likely that you'll pick up single drinks in a short period of time in urine, but it is highly unlikely that you will pick up a single drink, standard drink. We have to be clear on that because one bottle is not a drink, right? And so you can always have an absurd situation when you don't use precise, when you're not using precise language. But a single standard drink, which is 14 to 16 grams ethanol, or like a standard beer, if you will, it is highly unlikely that that would be enough ethanol to generate a positive EtG hair or nail. And I'll go back to the study from Scandinavia, Dr. Kronstrand. They had a very good study where they looked at people who were actually having a drink every day for 90 days. And men were having 2 drinks every day for 90 days. And while some of them had trace amounts and were detected, none of them were near the cutoff. Now, since then, the assays have gotten a little better, but that would still apply even today.
Wonderful. So would alcohol hand sanitizer show up in nail concentrations?
Should not. That's the same principle of exposing ethanol to the hair or the nails. And so the Purell, which is a very high content ethanol in that preparation, 60 to 70%, depending on the brand, but it does not form EtG there at the site. And you can barely pick that up in urine if you're using Purell like a lot. And urine is by far more sensitive than hair for EtG, ETS.
Gotcha. How about coloring and bleaching? Will that affect the results?
Yes, the data that I've seen and the literature that I've seen, there is an effect. And so does it knock it below the cutoff? Maybe not every time, but it is certainly a question. If you get an unexpected EtG hair negative, start thinking about, was there cosmetic treatment? And that's why having these, a whole buffet of assays to pick from can be important, whether it's head hair, body hair, fingernail, toenail, PETH and whole blood, blood spot, EtG, ETS, and urine. between those different specimen types, you should be able to execute at least one of them, which kind of brings up another question in that, you know, EtG in hair has limitations just like any other test. There's no such thing as a perfect test. Every test has advantages and limitations. And by mixing and matching these tests, so like for instance, if you match an EtG fingernail with say a PETH, either whole blood or blood spot, doesn't matter. You then take you fill in some gaps by having the two, because the PETH is going to be more sensitive, but the EtG in hair is going to give you a longer detection window. And so you can kind of get some cross-referencing, but be aware that you will have one that's positive, one that's negative, and it's not that something's wrong. It's that, you know, that story, that timeline, or the behavior is a little different, and it's not consistent drinking, you know, during the whole time.
Do you see a role for hair nail EtG testing to confirm a positive PET test?
Yes and no. And thank you, Dr. Elam, for that question. If you have a positive PETH and you do an EtG hair and that comes back positive, then yes, that would confirm that positive. But if the EtG hair comes back negative, there's many reasons why that could be negative. Maybe it was cosmetic treatment. Maybe the drinking was just not enough to generate a positive EtG in the hair or the nail, or there was excessive hygiene. So there's a number of issues. So kind of in our field, the general statement on that is that the result of a second collected specimen does not refute the validity of the first collected specimen. There may be reasons, intentional or unintentional, why one's positive, one's negative, or even one's negative and the other one's positive. It could be the other way around. And so there could be legitimate reasons for that. And you kind of have to keep digging and getting into the story, which obviously can be very, very difficult in some cases.
Thank you. And what is the drinking threshold to trigger a positive?
So that's going to be different for different people. But according to the consensus statement of the Society of Hair Testing, they're saying that a 30 picogram per milligram in hair is consistent with, not conclusive evidence of, but consistent with chronic excessive drinking. Well, what does that mean? So generally speaking, when we're talking about a single drink, we're talking about a dose, if you will, of 14 to 16 grams of ethanol. And that's going to depend on the country. It's going to depend on the organization. So WHO has slightly different nomenclature than CDC and all of that. So the 14 to 16 grams is a single drink. Imagine a can of like a standard beer, not like the craft beers that we're getting used to in this country. They're typically a lot stronger, but say like a Budweiser or a Miller, something, you know, something I was going to say off the shelf, but they're all off the shelf now. But like a standard beer, if you will, not one of these custom craft beers. But one of those you can count on that being a standard drink. Okay. Now, building on that definition, a binge, that definition by most groups, not all, is different for men and women, and that's because of the size and the distribution and the way the Widmark equation works. So for women, a binge is 4 of those drinks in 2 hours. Now, some people place the 2-hour time limit, or some organizations don't. I think that adding that time element really helps clarify what's going on, because 4 drinks over a 12-hour period of time would be not detectable under any circumstance. But 4 drinks in 2 hours for the average size woman, you're going to get a measurable blood alcohol on that, and you're going to see some other things down the road too. And for a man, 5 drinks in a 2-hour period of time. So now we've got the standard drink. Now we've got what's a binge. The chronic excessive drinking by some organizations, depends on the organization, is 4 or 5 of those binge episodes in the last 30 days. So you can kind of get a mental picture of what we're seeing here. Now, other organizations will use like this risky and approaching risky and non-risky drinking, and they're doing like 15 drinks in a week. And so I'm not as familiar in kind of mentally transposing that data as maybe I should be. I kind of, it's simple, and I like simple is, you know, a drink, a binge, chronic excessive drinking. To me, I can kind of see that and get my head wrapped around it. But in certain circumstances, just like with the Scandinavian data, you know, the men were having 14 drinks a week, and they were barely detectable. So you have to think about what the definition is, and are we using the definition in a precise manner, and then what does it mean? So the answer to the question, that chronic excessive drinking, the 4 to 5 binges in the last 30 days, that's kind of when you start to expect the EtG in the hair to be above 30. So you got someone with a 220 EtG in the hair, okay, yeah. So that's clearly above that 30 threshold, and you can see how that matches with the self-report.
Thank you. So everyone, while you guys get some of your last questions in, I've got one more poll question for you guys. Would you like a representative to contact you to learn more about direct alcohol biomarkers? All right, so we have a few more questions coming in. Dr. Jones, does deodorant affect the results of a body hair sample?
I've not seen data to support that. Doesn't mean the data is not out there. I've just not seen it. And I say it that way because I was chastised this week that, Joe, you've not read all 25,000 papers. How can you say that? Now, of course, I've not read 25,000 papers, but it's not been brought to my attention. I've read a lot of them, but not 25,000. But if someone has a peer-reviewed literature article about that, please share it with me, and we'll make it available in some FAQs or whatnot. So, but I've not seen the data.
Wonderful. So EtG can be affected in urine by having diabetes. Is this also true with hair and nails?
Again, I have not seen any data that correlated the diabetes with the hair and the nail. And a lot of that, it happens in transit of the urine. It happens in transit. And with the hair and the fingernails, that's, you know, it's not in solution, not going on.
Thank you. And it looks like here's another one. Are there signs we should be aware of that indicate people are trying to cheat a test?
You know, standing before the evaluator with a full head of hair and showing up with the collector shaved bald, that would be a red flag. Bleaching, perming, dyeing, chemical straightening, that would be a red flag. Other than that, you know, there's nothing out there to really hang your hat on. But it's kind of like the obvious things for any assay with the hair. They start cosmetic treatment, or all of a sudden they're changing styles, and you know, and you know, people get haircuts, you know, and you can't hold that against them. But you know, someone going from a ponytail to a shaved head, okay, what's going on here? Doesn't prove anything, but it sure does raise a flag. But that's why it's important to have all of these different tools in your tool belt. And that, okay, you shaved your head, maybe we can do chest hair, underarm hair, maybe go downstairs, get leg hair, or go fingernail, toenail, and at least you've got something that you can test. Because at the end of the day, in these environments, you know, this is not about the got you, or you know, get you, we're going to get you. That's not what this is about. There may be some cases like that, but the vast majority of the tests that we're doing in the environment that we're doing these tests are being conducted in order to confirm someone's abstinence, confirm their abstinence. So if they're negative, I mean, that's not conclusive evidence that they've been abstinent, but it does help you confirm that they're working the program like they should, or that they're not the extreme alcohol use disorder person that the ex-wife is accusing dad of being, ex-dad being. And so it allows them to allow this confirmation that they're working the program, or they're following the order of the judge, et cetera. If they interfere with that, well, then you can't do that. And so you're unable to collect any data to help them confirm their abstinence. And so, you know, when we are all in recovery, and you know, I know mine is with cigarettes and nicotine, and so, but not the issues that I know that a lot of our people are struggling with. But you know, you got to do it yourself, and these tests are here to help you. And you've got to allow the person trying to help you, and your evaluator and your counselor or your judge or your attorney to help you confirm your abstinence and make sure that you've got this accountability to move forward. Because the relapse, you know, especially this time of year, as an ex-smoker, I'd be lying if I told you I hadn't had a couple of, you know, I'd like to have a few here and there. But you know, it's a tool to help you confirm the abstinence.
Thank you, Joe. That's very informative. I do have our last question, and before we wrap things up, I just want to say if we didn't get to any of you guys' questions, we'll be sure to be following up after this event. So our last question is ethyl sulfate seen in hair?
I'm sure it is, Ernie. And Ernie, thank you for that question. And I'm fairly certain I have seen some papers where it was identified. But, you know, we do ethyl sulfate in urine as a mitigation over the problems of EtG. And if we go back into the origin of EtG in urine, you had problems with bacteria forming EtG in urine. You had problems with bacteria destroying EtG in urine. Early on, there was this concept of hyperproducers and hypoproducers, and it wasn't fair and this and that. EtG was stable to all of these bacteria. And with these two compounds, they're under very different genetic control. Being a high producer in both of these or a hypo producer in both of these was, you know, like mathematically really not feasible or practical. And so,
Yes, I can hear you. We lost you, but we can hear you.
I bumped my video wire. Sorry about that. But the ETS was a mitigating solution to the EtG. If we had started with ETS, we'd never be talking about EtG in urine in my mind, but it's just been so entrenched in the vernacular, if we will, we'll never get rid of EtG at this point. But when you get to hair and nails, we don't have those issues. And it is the more predominant species, so it actually makes sense to just look at the EtG and not worry about the ETS or the ethyl phosphate. That was a third one. And so we don't look for that either. Thank you, Ernie.
So much again, Dr. Jones, for answering all these questions for us. And for our attendees, if there's any suggestions on topics that you're interested in, we would love to hear from you. So please send us an email at adultandchild@usdtl.com. Definitely keep an eye out on your inbox for more information on our next ToxTime event. Don't forget to follow us on LinkedIn, Facebook, and Twitter for the most up-to-date information about USDTL. Thank you again for attending our ToxTime, and happy holidays.
Subscribe to our channel and visit our website for more information.